of our event, which is going to be a combined panel discussion and participant consultation on faith and religion in humanitarian action. So now I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our guest speakers, our panelists for today. So Alistair Ager will be continuing with us and joining the panel now, and he will be joined by 3 other guests. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Michel Vautey. Michel is a Deputy Permanent Observer of the Order of Malta to the UN in Geneva. He is also Vice President of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law and a Associate Professor at the Institut du Droit de la Paix et du Développement at Nice University in France. He has a long and distinguished career with the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, having held senior positions both at headquarters and in the fields. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome him to our office and to the event today. So welcome to Michel. We're also joined by Amjad Mohammed Salim. Amjad is a freelance consultant from Sri Lanka and the UK and was born in Nigeria. In this capacity as a freelance consultant, he has advised the Commonwealth Foundation, International Alert, among others. He has also worked as the head of communications and manager of conflicts program for the Cordoba Foundation. And he has been country director of the NGO Muslim Aid in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. A warm welcome to Amjad, and thank you for being with us. And last but not least, we're very pleased to welcome Beres Gwyn. Beres is also Geneva-based. I'll run through a few highlights of her career. Beres joined the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs in 1974. She served in Vietnam, Poland, Mexico, and Nauru, where she served as Australian High Commissioner. Since then, she has held senior positions with AusAid, the Australian International Development Agency, as well as World Vision Australia and the Global Water Partnership. She served as World Vision Partnership Leader for Global Accountability, starting from September 2008 and continuing in that role through mid-2014, and is currently serving here in Geneva as Director and UN Representative for World Vision International in Geneva, and we're very pleased to have her with us as well today. So for the structure of this portion of the events, we're going to do something a bit different. There are a lot of questions that have come in advance of the event from participants and have been inspired by the symposium of last week. We're structuring the event in 4 parts. So we're looking at 4 main questions, and we'll take now approximately 10 minutes on each part. So we'll be trying to move through quite rapidly while covering a lot of ground. So I'll pose the initial question to the panel. For ease of organization and to give everyone a sense of the order here, I will keep a consistent order going through the panel for each of the 4 questions. I'll begin always with Beres. Apologies, Beres. I'll begin with Beres, then I'll go to Amjad, then to Michel, then to Alistair, and then we will be posing follow-up questions if time allows and depending on the feedback from the participants. So starting then with the first section, the question is looking at key challenges. The question is, what is the single most prominent challenge that faith-based humanitarian organizations face in their work? And can you illustrate this, if possible, with a very brief real-world example? So we'll be turning first to Beres.
Thank you very much, Angarad. And good afternoon, everyone from Geneva. The most difficult thing about this question was that we were asked to name only one, the single most prominent challenge. In my view, the answer to that question is the co-option of faith spaces in today's society, from local to global levels, by people whose real objectives have nothing to do with faith, but have much more to do with power, privilege, prejudice, and plunder. And there are many examples, I think, where humanitarian situations emerging particularly from conflict are about competition for intellectual or religious dominance and access to resources. Now I'm going to slip in just an extra component here because I'd like to pick up some of the closing comments that Alistair made around how many of us, people of faith, who of course also operate within UN organizations, within the private sector, within governments around the world, many of us have accepted the secularization of the discourse. And so I think to conclude by saying this co-option of faith spaces, other people misusing the faith and development or religion or spirituality and development domain is partly a result of our having been silent in the face of secularization. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Angela.
Great, thank you, Beris. And moving now to Amjad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I think just following on from Barris's point, I think as part of that co-option, one of the things that comes up to me is the trust deficit that arises due to misperceptions about the aims and objectives of faith-based organizations and their work on the ground. And I think this in particular, I've seen in Sri Lanka, but most recently in Myanmar, where Muslim agencies were not able to work because there was a distrust as that they were only working for a particular part of the community. And I think that's where the challenge is. And on top of that, as part of this power dynamics that that was mentioned, you know, we do have particular challenges for Islamic agencies in regards with counterterrorism and all of these things. So I think this is where the trust deficit needs to be overcome in terms of for me as a single most prominent challenge. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And moving now to Michelle. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Anwar. Actually, I see two challenges. First, on the global picture of humanitarian action, faith-based organizations should not be forgotten or even excluded in today's humanitarian action. And I think that was what our good friend from America was saying, that with secularization now religion is pushed aside. And actually, we should not forget that faith-based organizations are the oldest humanitarian actors, quite often the closest to local communities, often active in the most difficult and dangerous spots. And then comes my second challenge. On the local field of operations, then FBOs have to gain access to local populations, and if they are there, to enjoy security for their staff and communities, and also to be able and willing, I would say, to extend their humanitarian action to non-believers beyond their own religious community. And to give just one brief example, the Order of Malta in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, often working mostly on behalf of Muslim communities or children. That's it.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, but yes, but I would say definitely then the the key word is to be both true to your own religious ideals and to abide by the humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality. That's it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michelle. And now we're moving to Alistair. You have the floor once again.
Thanks, Harrod. I think it's probably best to reinforce that. I was trying to make a new point, but in a sense, I think the points made by the other three panelists are all very significant around, it's partly around language, but the language for discussion and creating trust. And then I think Michael's comment very importantly about the language that is both peaceable and engaging and finding the common ground. But I think truth also means challenge, really. You know, it means standing up for things, and I think that relates to something that Beris was hinting at within, thinking of within the prophetic tradition of religion, of when it speaks truth to power and challenges inequalities. And I think there are components of religious experience within religious communities that are very powerful for creating social change, which are very relevant for humanitarianism. But we have this very challenging balance between letting go of that, using that power, but also being good citizens in diverse communities and being seen to take a seat at the table and to compromise. So I think we organizations with a faith affiliation have this double burden of both being general good citizens and working for the common good, but also using their exclusive potential value added of connection with a particular tradition, with a particular community. And I think that's a very difficult balance to get within humanitarian context. But I think the issue of trust and the issue of openness to dialogue is probably key to, in every situation, resolving that. And I'll just use a concrete example. Again, I'll just draw on the most recent work we've been doing in the Middle East, where I think there was some really very excellent work done by faith organizations, which at the third or fourth interview, we understood how interaction on gender-based violence and women's rights was framed with respect to the Quran, and effectively so. But we didn't hear about that in the first interview. There wasn't the sense of trust within local faith organizations to talk about that, the faith spaces, really, and the faith language. It was coded in a neutral form, thinking that that's the most acceptable way of doing it. And yes, we want to get on, but if we only get on by editing out things of our capacities, that's not going to be the solution for managing diversity in the 21st century. So it's finding ways of speaking when we have different traditions, but we are being a little bit more open about the specific insights and the potentials that our communities that we're speaking on behalf of or connecting to. So that balance, I think, is the biggest challenge.
Great, thank you. And now on this question, in this section of the discussion, we do have quite a lot of input coming from participants, and on that basis, we're going to pose a follow-up question to the panel. So this is drawing together the inputs of several participants, particularly Hannah, who's working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as Colleen, who's working currently in Lebanon, and others. The follow-up question to the panel is the following. Given that certain conflicts do have strong and complex religious overtones, what considerations should faith-based humanitarian actors take into account regarding when and how to respond? So we'll go through again in order for brief remarks. We'll start with Beris.
Thank you very much, Angharad. I'm going to ask if you would just repeat the question for me so that we have, that I'm answering correctly.
No problem at all. I'm happy to. The follow-up question is, given that certain conflicts do have strong and complex religious overtones, what considerations should faith-based humanitarian actors take into account regarding when and how to respond?
Okay, thanks very much. Apologies for the delay. My first reaction is that our representation of our identity as faith-based organizations, our having in place policies and procedures which include an ability to demonstrate transparently our performance, our accountability, have to be in place well before the response begins. And so I think that for those of us who are working in the humanitarian sphere, it is important that we have already established a reputation, not that we are already perfect or perfectly understand, but that we are wrestling with these issues and that we are doing our best to make sense of the environments in which we operate. So my first part of my response would be that we have to make sure that we are purpose fit and response ready. The second, I think, is that often in our response situations, agencies like World Vision, I think, are large enough to have pretty good systems in place. And of course, we're supported by the humanitarian sector around early warning, early action, preparedness, disaster risk reduction, conflict prevention, and so on. In those processes, I do think that FBOs, but all actors in the humanitarian space, need to allocate resources for much more profound research and analysis. Because I think we do have a tendency to leap in, thinking that we've got the situation covered, when to take perhaps an extra 48 hours to make sure that we've not only conducted our own research, but have consulted with key partners, including the faith leaders, both globally and locally, and our partner NGOs of different religious affiliations, so that when we do decide on a response, we've taken the relevant factors into account. Thank you.
Thank you. And moving now to Amjad.
Thank you. I think getting a better context analysis is definitely the key, not just for faith-based organizations, but for any organizations jumping in. I mean, if you were to listen to the Grand Mufti from the CAR and the Bishop in some of the initial talking that they did in 2013, 2014, a lot of what they said was that, look, what's happening in CAR is not a religious conflict. It is ethnic, it is political, but it's taking a religious tones. But we somehow jumped into it thinking it's a religious conflict. So I think that we do need to somehow step back and get a better understanding of the way that we can work. I mean, the other thing from so looking at these type of conflicts, I mean, faith-based organizations should be able to at least have a better understanding, a better literacy of what could drive people to commit sort of violence, and then help them to kind of overcome that through sort of trauma counseling, resettlement, giving them that spiritual attention. So I think that this is where we can start to make a move. And one of the challenges, though, for faith-based organizations sometimes is that they get pushed into something because they are there. You know, I mean, you're a Muslim agency. By virtue, you should be able to get access into Afghanistan, and then you get pushed into an agenda that is driven by an external donor, and then that sometimes can actually make things worse.
Right, thank you for that. And we'll turn to now to Michel. Michel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, key is to keep the trust of the local population and of the parties to the conflict. And this is both a question of institutional policy and individual behavior of representatives. Definitely, I could again give the example of the Order of Malta in Lebanon, where Muslims cooperate with the Order of Malta, and the Order of Malta using actually its emblem of the white cross on a red ground, and we use this to provide assistance to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So to have Muslims and Christians and Jews work side by side to help the population in need, regardless of their personal beliefs. But again, it means a strict institutional policy and a discipline by individual representatives.
Right, thank you. And Alastair, would you like to add anything on this follow-up question?
I think just two brief comments. I acknowledge that the understanding of what is a religious-based conflict is often now understood to be political conflict that is imposed upon certain religious identities, etc. And so the root of this is often imbalances in power rather than necessarily a direct religious conflict. But nonetheless, I think many of us have an appropriate reaction that religion sometimes gets in the way, and this concern that a number of agencies have, or a number of actors have, of religion contributing, I think is a valid concern. I think we need to acknowledge that and not explain that away. But in response to the question, and it's really what all of the other respondents have said, the alternative of denying or not engaging with religion makes no sense whatsoever. If there is a sense to which conflict is exacerbated by religious misunderstandings or religious conflicts, engagement with religious actors has to be part of that. And I think that's what we're partly calling for, is a sense of engaging. I take very much Beres's point and others, of engaging on the long term. And so this is not in the context of an emergency response. There is trust, there are relationships that can be drawn upon. And I think the CAR example again is a good one, where there have been things that were put in place that created a counter-narrative to the exploitation of religious differences for political reasons. So although conflict is often seen as a justification for shying away from religion, I think if we look at it more carefully, it really calls us to a more purposeful, planned, contextual engagement with religion as part of our analysis in supporting humanitarian response.
Right, thank you. So thank you very much to our panel. We'll be moving now to the second part of the panel discussion, looking at the role of faith-based organizations. The question here is, do faith-based organizations have a unique role to play in humanitarian action? For example, in terms of access, better understanding the needs of affected people, better ability to respond to certain needs, etc. And if possible, to illustrate your answer with a brief real-world example. So we'll go again first to Beres. You have the floor.
Thank you. Well, this one's easy because a number of the responses to the question are actually built in. Certainly from my point of view, faith-based organizations do have a unique role. It's partly because we collectively have secularized the humanitarian space, leaving the faith-based organizations those whose mandate requires them to continue to reflect the fact that the vast majority of people on the planet do make sense of their world on the basis of belief system or conceptual framework. And this has been borne out in recent studies, most notably by the Pew Institute. It's less prominent in the more advanced economies, which I think takes us back to the discussion about how secularization has led us to see the world in transactional or instrumental rather than relational terms. And that's where I would like to suggest that the FBOs have a unique role to play. I don't believe we can claim we're more efficient. I don't think we can even assume we're more highly motivated. But I do think that since we are also sharing the struggles of that faith journey, we understand where people are coming from. We do need to work harder at respecting different points of view, but I believe we're making good progress in working with leaders of different faith communities. And we have examples of our collaboration through the Channels of Hope initiative, most recently with CAFOD and others on the Ebola response, where we bring understanding of local customs and traditions, where we're able to work with other faith leaders to use our own scriptures of different traditions so that we can provide guidance and support, and where we need to be advocates in relation to issues of tolerance or justice or child protection. So absolutely, I believe we have a unique role, but that's for the next question. Thanks, Ankarad.
Okay, great. Thank you, Beres. And we're moving now to Amjad. Amjad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, as Beres mentioned, I think the Pew research does show that a lot of people around the world have faith or concept of spirituality, religion, as they have something that drives them, and they have an affiliation to a faith. And we've found in Sri Lanka that when there's an emergency, when there's a conflict, or when there's just a natural emergency like a flood, often people will rush to the nearest faith-based institution for safety, for security, and they rely on the local faith leader to give them guidance. So as having worked in a faith-based organization, what we did find is that by going to the faith-based organizations, we were able to really plug into the existing networks of the faith institutions. We were able to work with the imams and the priests, and actually this went beyond just one of your own community. I mean, working for Muslim Aid, I found that I was able to sometimes work with the local church or the local temple because they kind of felt that we had a different approach to looking at the problem than, say, a secular organization. So I think that there is some real opportunity to plug into those existing networks. We recognize that faith institutions are first responders, and I think it's about capacity building and supporting those things better. And in fact, you do have better access, better understanding, better ability to respond. Alice's example in Aceh was apt when people were responded to. They often asked for other things, fill their spiritual needs as opposed to their material needs, and it's often faith-based organizations that can understand that better.
That's great. Thank you. And you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. Yes, first I completely agree with Beris. And I would like to add that indeed, faith-based organizations are often rooted in local communities, closely working with the population for years, in constant communication with local actors. They understand better their needs, their cultures, the way they live on a daily basis, better than expatriates posted for a limited time in the field. Thus, it seems to me that it's easier for them to respond properly to their needs, be it medical, food, housing, and clothes, and also they provide immaterial spiritual relief, I think even beyond their own community. And a last point, I would say that quite often FBOs are willing to take security risks no other humanitarian action, no other humanitarian organization would be ready to face. And quite often those security risks are very serious. That's it.
Thank you, Michel. And Alastair, would you like to add on this question? You have the floor.
Yeah, I'll try and be a little bit controversial, I think, by saying I think, particularly in the context of the review, the reform of the humanitarian system, is that with the current humanitarian system, we minimize the added value or the potential value of faith-based organizations, particularly at a local level. I think in a system which is widely seen as sort of top-heavy and weak with local engagement, and with the key interests of actors to really align with accessing bilateral funds and sharing a common language of efficiency to delivering that to predetermined goals, inevitably the added value of the diversity of different actors within the sector more generally is not much use. We want contractors basically to deliver food or shelter. That's the key driver of the model. And in our fieldwork on the ground, we see that then works through that local organizations are indeed seen as contractors, principally to deliver assistance to an agenda that was determined in the north. Absolute values that Michel and Amjad were pointing to, that these community-based organizations may have 10, 20, 30 years track record, but really they're being asked not to be a true partner, but to be one that basically delivers something that's predetermined, where the local trust with the community may be an added value, but it's not really the central focus of the intervention. I think what we're trying to push for, what many are trying to push for in the process towards the summit in Istanbul next year, is, to use this phrase again from Oxfam, a system turned on its head, where the question is asked, what is the response capacity locally, and how can we as international actors support that? And if we frame the question that way, then absolutely all the reasons that have been given so far on the panel are absolutely true, that there is a track record, there's trust, there's engagement, and then there's significant added value of that diversity and that embeddedness, that rootedness, and that diversity potentially within communities. And then our role, as if we see ourselves as international actors, is very much to support and to engage that activity rather than to drive something from the north. So I think the current system doesn't really get the best value out of that richness at the local level. And if we really want to get the value out of that, we do need to repunctuate, to restructure the way we understand this and see that it's very much community-led or certainly national-led response with international supplementary support to that.
Excellent, thank you. Before I move into follow-up questions, I'd just like to highlight some of the results that came in as our panelists were speaking through the instant polls. We saw that while there was not 100% agreement, the vast majority of those in the virtual room today answering the poll did also feel that faith-based organizations do have a unique role. And among the various potential advantages, if you will, that faith-based organizations may have, by far, it seems, according to today's group, the most significant of those is that potential for better connection with local faith-based networks for humanitarian response, which, as Alistair was saying, is certainly a broader theme that's arisen throughout the World Humanitarian Summit consultation process. Now moving into a quick follow-up. So this is picking up on a number of the comments and questions that have come in the last few minutes, in particular from Kate in the US, from Jaume, who's currently based in Afghanistan, also Adelaide, currently a student in Germany. Picking up on their inputs, we've compiled them into one follow-up question for our panel and also for our participants. The follow-up question is as follows. Given that faith-based organizations do have a special role to play, does this mean that they actually have a responsibility to specialize in the humanitarian contexts where they do have, if you can use the words, comparative advantage, even if those contexts might be more challenging? So is there a responsibility of a sort on faith-based organizations to specialize in certain areas? So we'll begin again with Baris.
In the question, because the humanitarian imperative requires that we respond where the need is. So whether there are religious overtones or whether there are people of faith or no faith involved, I think most of us would be making our determinations based on an assessment of whether we are positioned to be able to provide assistance or whether that assistance will be better delivered by other parties. Where I do think the question is on target is that those unique characteristics which we claim as people of faith do level of responsibility, which has to do in about our being transparent about who we are and what we're doing, about our making sure not just that we have nicely worded policies and guidelines in place, but that we proactively are building the faith literacy of our own staff. In some ways, I believe the UN system, in some ways only, may be ahead of the NGO sector because they've had the resources to put together nice sets of guidelines about working with faith communities. World Vision has been part of the process that began with the UNHCR protection dialogue, Faith and Protection, where we've been gathering faith literacy materials that exist in the NGO sector. And it's one of the initiatives that I'm hoping we'll be able to bring to a completion before the World Humanitarian Summit. So that responsibility certainly exists. And I think importantly, we need to create spaces, again, as we will be doing as World Vision later this year, to convene discussions with other faith actors so that we can share good practices and agree on the activities which need to be ended, which create difficulty for us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Baris. And we'll be turning now to Amjad. Amjad, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and I think I fully agree with what Baris said. I mean, I think where you will not get any faith-based organizations that says that they don't have a responsibility to respond to humanitarian crisis. I mean, I think every faith-based organization will say that they it is part of their spiritual calling or spiritual framework that they have to respond. I think where where we need to kind of maybe identify where the responsibility is, because they're faith-based organizations, perhaps that there is an added responsibility for them to, as Bear said, to be not only transparent but to be more efficient, to actually work with addressing some of the issues of people on the ground. And I think that's where they do bring that added comparative advantage. But also I think there's a responsibility on the system, and both for the faith-based organizations and the sort of secular organizations, to realize that faith plays a role, and that faith-based organizations have a seat at the table. And I think often you find that there is this kind of apprehension, concern, that people don't really want to engage with faith-based organizations, and so they kind of get shut out. But I think what we need to do is to realize that they do have a role to play, and with that role, that there's a role to actually realize what they can bring to the table that is fundamentally fits in with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and then how does that work in practice. And I think this is where that responsibility is, to really articulate how they fit into that system. And I think this is where we're often finding a gap between theory and practice.
Right, thank you. And we'll move now to Michel. Michel, you have the floor.
Yes, I would like to possibly point to two special roles FBOs could play. And first, that's something which is not often mentioned, but I think religious organizations often have contributed to peaceful settlements and reconciliation in post-conflict situations. They have been working with governments, with international organizations, with human rights defenders, for example, for truth and reconciliation commissions in Africa and Latin America, Christian and Muslim community leaders in the Central African Republic, the Imam and Pastor story in northern Nigeria, Sante Gigio also in Mozambique, achieving peace in Mozambique with the support of the British and the Italian government. I would say this is also part of the broader humanitarian picture. Second, religious organizations have the duty to be the moral conscience. And for example, when the George W. Bush administration decided to change the legal definition of torture, then you had faith-based organizations, the American Conference of Catholic Bishops, you have Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim spiritual leaders signing a handbook, to say torture is a moral issue. And I think that's only religious leaders can perform that kind of duty, because even human rights organizations have not this moral leadership, have not this moral authority to provide, I would say, a recourse against too easy changes in humanitarian and human rights standards. And I think it's very important, because now we have a real threat to human life and dignity. And this real threat will not be met by new treaties, but will be met by public conscience. And public conscience, that's really the role of FBOs and spiritual leaders in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. And we're moving now to Alistair.
Just briefly, two reflections. One, I strongly support Michel's comments there in terms of the potentially significant role in terms of faith groups, in terms of peacekeeping, and this moral prophetic role within society, speaking against injustice and against potential power. I think that the organization within faith traditions is a crucial counterweight in some of these issues. And so in terms of that notion of distinctiveness, I think those are the roles where I think we would expect, and there indeed there is a responsibility for faith communities to speak. The other comment is just the reality that, and he's not to be too much of an academic about definitions, actually what a faith-based organization is actually quite difficult, because as I've worked in more and more diverse settings, there are organizations that, to all intents and purposes, for me, seem faith-based, but their own understanding of that identity is that it's in their lived experience. They are just people coming together, not necessarily around promoting any faith agenda. And also the counter suggestion to this, so there's a danger that our notion of faith-based is again this rather reductionist, rather Western one of do you agree to these certain principles, and are these the things that you've signed up to? Whereas in many people, the lived experience of their faith, their culture, their history are all wrapped together, and they may not see that as a particular distinctive that separates them from a neighbouring civil society organisation that doesn't necessarily have those descriptors. So just an acknowledgement that although we're generally understanding that there is such a thing as religion and faith active in communities, the actual understanding of a particular subgroup of particularly CBOs as faith-based can be quite problematic in some contexts where there is more of an integrated understanding of history, culture and religion and ethnic identity, also determining how people understand the calling of their mission and what brings them together.
Great, thank you. So we'll be moving now quickly to our third part, where we'll be looking at obstacles to collaboration and coordination. I would also like to announce we will be changing the order of the panel. So we're halfway through the discussion here, or a little more than halfway in terms of the time. And for some variety, we're going to change the order. So we will now, for the next rounds, be starting with Michel, then going to Alastair, then to Amjad, then to Baris. So now, the question before us is, should faith-based and other humanitarian organizations work more closely together? And if yes, what are the obstacles to such coordination and cooperation? If no, why? So we'll be beginning now with Michel. Michel, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I would just give one example. When I was a regional delegate for the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, in Southern Africa, I was also involved in a program for detainees in Madagascar. And in Madagascar, the ICRC, which is not a religious organization, decided to work with l'Aumônerie Catholique des Prisons, the Catholic chaplain of prisons. And why so? Because we decided that actually we had there a lady, a Malagasy lady, a lady from Madagascar, who had the trust of everyone. I must say the Ministry of Justice, detention authorities, and also, of course, detainees. And she was regularly visiting every detention place. She was visiting them, of course, for spiritual reasons. But we asked her, please, could you check if there are any problems in the treatment of prisoners? We don't want to deal with in any way with your religious duties, but we want you to help us in monitoring whatever is happening in the jails. And if there is any problem, please you come to us and we'll discuss that bilaterally with the Ministry of Justice. Actually, we had at that time cooperation agreement with them, and it worked perfectly well because everyone was working according to their own mission or mandate. And I think what is really needed is to first know each other, and second, trust each other, and be sure that actually we are expecting the right thing from the right people, and of course to have this transparency not only between ourselves, but of course with the people we are working with, and of course with the authorities involved in this action. That's what I would like to say, and definitely I think that what we did also, and what the ICRC is still doing, is to try to engage spiritual leaders, mostly in Muslim countries, and to tell them, look, we want you to understand what we are doing, and we want you especially to understand that our fundamental principles and our fundamental rules, and actually international humanitarian law, is perfectly compatible with your spiritual values. And this, again, is not the ICRC trying to discuss theology with theologians, but actually to engage in a dialogue where everyone keeps his or her own position. And I think it's very constructive. And I think we definitely need to move more into a dialogue, more into, I would say, mutual knowledge and mutual trust. That's it.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're moving to Alistair. Alistair, you have the floor.
Well, again, I'd really like to build on what Michelle was saying, and yes, we need to work more closely together, all actors. That's clearly in the interest of humanitarian beneficiary populations. What are the obstacles? Well, I jotted 3 down, which fit in, I think, very neatly with something Michelle was saying. A lack of knowledge of other partners and their capacities, their existence in some cases, and their perspective. That might be around faith literacy, although I think that's a limited term, but basically a broader knowledge and understanding of other actors and other perspectives. The second thing for me is a lack of self-awareness, and I go back to some points I made in the initial reflections, and I think Beres particularly picked up on those. And actually, in a sense, Michelle has talked on that about each keeping to their own position. Are agencies aware that they have a position? They're often aware that a religious group has a position, but often agencies act as if they just do what is obvious to do, that they don't come from somewhere, they don't have certain assumptions. And the discussions around the common humanitarian standard have led to some interesting discussions around this notion of neutrality, which now has a footnote recognizing that although neutrality doesn't just involve not taking sides in combat, it also involves avoiding engagement in controversial issues. There's now a footnote that says some agencies acknowledge that their mandate requires them to engage in political advocacy for change, which most agencies do. But that is position, that there's something that drives us to challenge inequity in education because we believe in the equity of girls and boys, or in terms of other aspects of anti-violence. And so the sense that there are some people who have values and positions which are called religious organizations, and then there are some groups that just do the right thing, is, I think, a danger that we have. And so I completely agree with Michelle that if we have more of a self-awareness that what is our position, what are our assumptions, and we know that others make other assumptions, but we can come together, that is a huge step forward, not just between secular organizations and faith-based organizations if there were 2 separate groups, but just in the diversity of assumptions and histories and cultural routings that we have. And then the third thing I think is an obstacle is the skills to manage that process of that openness and diversity. And again, I think Michelle was hinting at that it's challenging in those situations where we're putting our values on the table, we're acknowledging our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think the skills for humanitarian coordination for that model with local ownership is very different from the skills of humanitarian coordination when we see that as largely something directed, again, from Geneva or from New York. And I think that's an obstacle to create a humanitarian workforce able to work with diverse communities and bring them together around common local agendas is absolutely key.
Thank you for that. We'll now be moving to Amjad. Amjad, you have the floor.
I'm agreeing with what Alistair and Michelle have said. I mean, you know, the notion of partnership is now that no organization can operate in isolation in today's complex world. It is about encouraging institutions to work across those traditional boundaries to enhance core competencies. I mean, the challenge though is that one is how do we get out of this time again problem of mandates and strategies. Partnership is not about just funding. It's not about finance. It's about actually working together, and that there are problems in terms of power dynamics, particularly if there's a big organization versus a small organization. How is that perceived in terms of the power dynamics, in terms of who accesses the funding? So I think those are some of the challenges that can come up. When I was working with Muslim Aid, we had a partnership with UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief in Sri Lanka. It worked very well in Sri Lanka on the ground, but when we tried to take it into a global setting, it didn't really kind of kick off because there was problems of the dilution of identity. There was a problems of, as Alistair was saying, skills. There was a problem of perception of which was the dominant partner in this relationship. So I think that's something that is there. But if you were to look in terms of the need for it, I mean, you don't only need partnerships between faith-based and other humanity. You need cross-faith and intra-faith partnerships, and then this is where I think often we, as faith-based organizations, sometimes struggle. Is that we're very good at having partnerships with secular organizations. We're slightly reluctant to go into an interfaith relationship or even an intra-faith relationship, and I think that's where we need to be really honest about what ultimately our objectives are, and if that's to deliver better to people in need, and I think we need to be able to kind of rise above that. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, moving to Baris. Baris, you have the floor.
Very much again. I have just two things. One is that I think in some ways this is a false dichotomy, that we are asking whether faith-based and other humanitarian organizations should work more closely together. As I mentioned previously, within all spheres of human activity, there are people of faith. Also, the assumption that a secular organization somehow operates with more probity or with a higher set of values and accountability, I think that can be challenged as well. I would really like to see two things happen. One is that faith-based organizations need to rediscover the language that explains our role and contribution beyond service delivery. I think we've somehow failed to articulate the importance of the role of faith in communities and its impact on humanitarian response. The second, though, is that I do think that the compartmentalization of the humanitarian space also means that we are often suffering double standards. All humanitarian actors need to be assessed against the same set of principles. I think we could easily point to examples of politicization, privatization, militarization, and these are not uniquely Western. So no organization is immune from ignorance, misunderstanding, sometimes even mischief. And so a collective approach to discussion of these issues, clarity around ethical standards, the boundaries, to pick up comments that have been in the chat. Yes, of course, faith-based organizations do want other people to come to their point of view, but there are appropriate and inappropriate ways of sharing one's faith, and responsible organizations have some clarity and do spend time investing in staff training to make sure that those limitations and boundaries are understood. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a number of questions coming in. I'd like to particularly thank Kristen, who is asking if we could dig deeper into the notion of instrumentalization of religion that was raised. Others, for example, Zornitsa, wanting to dig into the relationship between donor agencies and donor trends and faith-based organizations, faith-based humanitarian action. I think, unfortunately, in this event, we won't be able to take all of the time that we would like to follow those tracks, but I think there may be some inspiration to take these discussions further, as there are many very valuable points that are being raised and threads that should be followed. But in the meantime, we're going to move now to our part 4. And actually, this is answering at least one question that's come in from Olivia, who was noting that a lot of the conversation so far today has been focused really exclusively or almost exclusively on faith-based organizations. And Olivia is wondering about how secular organizations should interact with religion and what can be done better. So in this fourth part, the question to the panel and also to all of our participants today is the following. In general, is the way that religion is handled in humanitarian action currently appropriate? And if not, what do you see as the main problems? So now we'll start with Michel. Michel, you have the floor.
I would say if we look at the UN, for example, at Sendai, if we look at various, including regional version of the World Humanitarian Summit, you see that clearly, especially governments, or some governments, including European governments, are trying to push FBOs out of the picture. And this is very clear. This is very clear. I was in Sendai, I was in Budapest, and I can tell you it was very disturbing. So I would say definitely religion cannot be ignored anymore. And we should insist to be part of the picture. And I say we are not to be ashamed of being what we are or who we are. Institutionally and personally, and actually we should be not only more vocal in our own personal faith, but more vocal in our institutional existence, and also possibly more public in what we're doing, because quite often FBOs are not making enough publicity on what they are doing, and that's why I think, especially if you look at interagency standing committees, if you look at pledging conferences and so on, you will see that in many cases FBOs are not part of the big picture, and this should change. That's it.
Thank you, Michel. And we'll be moving now to Alistair. Alistair, the floor.
Yes, I want to try and link it to some of my preliminary comments. So no, I don't think religion is appropriately handled at the moment. There's clearly some flux and some questioning, but my understanding is that there's an attempt to have closer relationships with a religion, but without making the adjustments to the framing, to the thinking, to the understanding to really enable that to happen. And that, I think that leads to this notion of instrumentalization, of getting closer but really not understanding, just using for the same goals. I've been very struck by a comment that we've drawn on in the book that you mentioned at the beginning, Anna Harrod, which is that management of diversity is the key challenge of the 21st century, just politically. And if we see that humanitarianism has to increasingly adjust to a very complex political world, but one manifest by diversity of view, I think we have to say, does the previous way of thinking that a certain neoliberal secular framing, is that a language that everyone can speak and is very neutral? And I think we have to conclude that it isn't. Just as Michel said, it seems to enable some in the tent and some people outside the tent, and it means that for a number of religious groups feel that the understanding of religion is a very Western one that's used to box them in and not understand them. So I think we need to humbly see that we need to manage diversity. We're not trying to prefer religious groups over non-religious groups and things, but we're trying to manage diversity. And that to do that, we need actors to understand the technical word, I think, is their situatedness, where they come from, what their values are, what the drivers are, what they're pushing, and maybe just be more open and honest about that rather than, I think, hiding behind the notion of neutrality. I spoke to a man running a CBO in Irbid who had been turned down for funding because his organization, because of its Muslim links, was seen as potentially not neutral in the situation. And he said to me, who is neutral? Your humanitarian regime, what is this but the garbage truck that runs around following failed US foreign policy experiments? Now, you may not take that view, but from where he sat, international agencies receiving significant bilateral funding to support the strategy in Syria was not a neutral position. It was an understandable position, but it was not a neutral one. And the offence to assume that because of his religious belief he was not neutral, whereas these international actors were neutral, was clear to see and I think ready to understand. So I think the engagement with religion needs to be one in which we see that in the diversity we have, both secular and religious, we need to find ways of acknowledging that we all come to the table with agendas. And as was hinted at in some of the earlier discussions, for really lasting peace and the knowledge of peoples, which is the key principle of humanitarianism, the key principle of humanity, that often that notion of so that all peoples may live in peace, that is often now missed out. It's missed out in the common humanitarian standard. That's been edited out. Whereas humanitarian work that brings us together in our difference is really a key contribution. So I think that's the challenge, the difficulty of denying the difference, trying to find common language, but not successfully doing that, and finding new ways of, in the midst of diversity, finding common purpose and a common humanity.
Thank you. To Amjad. Amjad, we'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you. I mean, I have to agree that it is, in my opinion, quite handled inappropriately, mainly because of the fact that I think that there's two things. One is there's a slight hypocrisy on the part of certain kind of agencies and players who do not want to speak with the religious actors in the ground, within the room, but will work with religious actors on the ground because they realize that in order for them to get access to communities in need, they have to work with faith-based actors. So I think that there is definitely a sense that of hypocrisy, and there's a definite sense of uneasiness, and part of that uneasiness comes from the fact that, as Baris was saying, that I think the faith-based organizations and religious institutions also need to articulate a language that clearly states what their contribution to this discussion on humanitarianism is, and it goes back to, even, do we really have an understanding of the humanitarian principles, and if so, does it differ to our religious principles, or do they synergize with each other? I mean, those discussions need to take place so that we can articulate the role that can be played, and then somehow break that or bridge that loss of confidence that people have about wanting to engage with faith and wanting to engage with religion. I think there's a second aspect to it, is that the donors as well need to also realize that religion and religious actors have a role to play and should be handled. And I think if you look at the current challenge, particularly for a lot of agencies working in the Middle East, or particularly a lot of Muslim agencies as well, where it's tied to a securitized agenda, where it's tied to counterterrorism, all of these things, then you have an issue. And I think this is where there needs to be greater clarity on how one is engaging with this and how it's handled, and the role that is played. And not to discount it, not to kind of give it a tokenistic sort of, yeah, we know that you guys are there, but but to actually have you as key players and participants in this, as Michelle was saying. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move now to Baris.
Thank you very much. This is a very challenging question, because I think it requires that we consider our own individual and collective responsibility. Even people of faith are, as we've just heard from other panelists, complicit. We should be doing much more in prevention, mitigation, reconciliation than we do at the moment. Our tendency has been to have just joined the fray in humanitarian response because that's where the action is. So for me to rebalance our daily life ahead of a humanitarian response, and then to make sure that our behavior after a disaster or an emergency has taken place sustains that commitment as faith-based organizations rather than closing doors when the funds run out. I think there are some really very significant challenges for each of us. The second point I want to make picks up again something that others have said. There is a lack of commissioned, comprehensive and objective analysis and a dearth of resources available. When you see how much money is spent in other places, how much more could be achieved if we took the time to think more carefully about some of these issues. But having said that, I think this can be a diversionary tactic, and we need to be quite smart about how we articulate the role that we play and the contribution that we make. I want just maybe to finish by saying, by acknowledging that these are the very complex and very difficult issues. In many contexts, there are security considerations, and a number of our organizations have experienced the loss of staff because of the misuse of religion in relation to emergency and humanitarian situations. So I think we do have an opportunity with the WHS to reinsert human in humanitarian, to restore philos in philanthropy, because I think we as a species have lost meaning in many of these respects. And we have to also reinstate justice in a rights-based approach. Otherwise, we're just part of the industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we've come now to the close of our events. We'll just have a couple of minutes of wrap-up points here. I'd like to very much thank all of our panelists, Michelle, Baris, Amjad and Alastair for their remarks, and also our participants for the very interesting and voluminous amount of contribution here on all of the discussion questions that posed. I'd like to point out that we at PHAP will be producing a report of today's event, bringing in all of the threads of content from the chat, from the submitted questions and comments, many of which we weren't able to pick up today, but will hopefully be able to pick up in other fora in the not too distant future. We'll also be drawing in, of course, the content gathered through the poll responses and the contributions from our panelists. I'd like to go around the panel one more time and offer our guest panelists the opportunity to provide a very brief closing remarks, so something in the line of 20 to 30 seconds. So we'll go again through in the same order we've been recently, starting with Michelle, if you have any brief closing remarks for us today.
Yes. I would say rediscover the religious dimension of the human person humanitarian action, include religious leaders in the development and implementation of humanitarian assistance and protection standards, ask FBOs to support the respect by all parties to armed conflicts of human life and dignity of civilians, and also, in general, be more active in prevention, resilience building, reconstruction and reconciliation. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. And now to Alastair.
Well, I've been very encouraged by the discussion and particularly by the interest online and the questions online. I suppose my hope is that this is one of a number of pebbles thrown in a pond that spreads in terms of dialogue, particularly into theatres of humanitarian action, and particularly at the local level and at the interface between local actors and international actors. I think it's very promising to use the structure of the World Humanitarian Summit preparation. And I go back for the third time to this lovely phrase, I think, from Oxfam, turning the system on its head. If it really is understood that we need to reframe and we really need to see local agenda setting, local resources at the fore of the understanding, and then international actors supplementing that, we know that religious actors, religious discourse, religious language, religious themes will be prominent in that agenda, because we know, we refer to the Pew Research, 80% of the world's strong religious affiliation, and maybe not in European centres and some other northern centres, but in most contexts, the language, the institutions that refugees, other people affected by crisis will call upon are religious institutions quite frequently. And so if we're really serious about local-led, local-owned, then this agenda is there. It's not us imposing it on an agenda, it's about acknowledging that it's there in the communities with which we work, and then supporting the growth and the sustenance of this dialogue and the ways that agencies, secular and faith-affiliated, can support those local agendas of recovery.
All right, thank you. And you have the floor for closing remarks.
Thank you. I think I just want to reflect on a story of Tao Sen, who's the master magician at the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who had 15 instruments in the emperor's chamber, which he had tuned to one frequency. And upon playing just one instrument's musical note, the other 14 started to resonate, to the astonishment and delight of the audience. I think what I'd like to probably sort of share is that maybe engagement with faith-based organizations as either one of these 15 instruments or one of the instruments that can get the other 14 resonating is a way for communities to work in harmony to achieve the result that all of us are, because we're in this line of work, is that we want to see a better world. And for me, I think this is why religion matters and why faith-based organizations need to be part of the solution and part of this 15 musical instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally,
thank you very much. I'm going to pick up Alistair's word and say, with humility, I believe that humanitarian actors, but particularly FBOs, need to reframe the narrative to restore the focus on the communities we claim to serve, but also among ourselves to renew efforts to strengthen mutual support and accountability. Thanks.
wonderful. Thank you. Thanks once again to all. I'd also like to thank the rest of the team here at PHAP that has made our event possible today, particularly Marcus Forsberg, behind the scenes with hands in all aspects of producing today's event. Thank you very much to you, Marcus, and also to our intern, Pedro. Pedro Silva Rocha Lima has also been tremendously helpful in the preparations for today's event. So thanks to both of you. And now in closing, I'll just mention that the recording of today's event will be available within the next few hours at the URL you see before you, phap.org/4JUN2015. And I'd also like to highlight the next upcoming event in this series of events PHAP is producing in support of the World Humanitarian Summit process. The next event will be on the subject of trafficking in persons in times of crisis, and will take place on the 18th of June at 4:30 p.m. Central European Summer Time. And that will be in partnership with IOM, with Caritas, with the World Humanitarian Summits, and hosted, produced by PHAP. So we hope to see many of you there. So with that, I will be signing off. This is Ann Lang at PHAP in Geneva, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye for now. Of our event, which is